I'm Jenny, and I think I've probably been in contact with most of you over the last month or so about the colloquium. From my side, it's really just a few small things. I'll speak to you more about other details later. But firstly, it's great to see everyone here. It's great to see everyone who's online. There was a query about Wi-Fi, and we have sorted that out. We'll share the login details and password shortly, so then everyone can get online. But yeah, for now, really it's just to open the colloquium session, which I will hand over to Michael Ochirefo, our great colleague and partner and organizer, collaborator for the network.
I'm so delighted we are here. In 2019, the conversation hasn't broken, but physically we couldn't meet. And we're really looking forward to this. I'd like to thank Andre, who is a lifeblood of this, and Dina, who, together with all of us, have been thinking this network has to go from strength to strength. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how we sort of envision moving forward. So, Andre, would you like to begin?
Okay. Thanks, Michael. It is, sometimes I'm very, very grateful. Just the way things fall together with, with me not even lifting too hard a muscle or a finger. So thanks to the young team that pulled this together. And of course, welcome to all. It is so great when things come together. We've planned from the beginning, between 50 and 70 participants in person. And it seems to me like that is the total that we have here. And then we also have an online presence and then also a streaming presence. So on behalf of our university, Nelson Mandela University, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. This is not taken for granted, okay? The colleagues who have traveled from our continent, from other parts of the world, from other parts of the country, a very, very warm welcome. Of course, we will have to make time, on the sides to get to know each other a bit better. There's some great people around here in this space, and then chat to one another and, of course, build a family. Co-host, of course, Queen's University, Belfast, Dina. University of Ghana, Michael, the HSRC. Thierry, to you and your colleagues, thanks so much for this. And, of course, thanks to the National Research Foundation who funds this project. Our friends from abroad and those who are linking up in different kinds of ways and across different time zones, thank you so much for that. To Jenny, Fortunate, Michaela, and the teams for planning and holding the event together. And of course, also, we have put together a complicated hybrid event, and you know that things will go wrong this way or the other. I just ask you to bear with us. There will be a few hiccups here and there, but we have our good friend Ponso, who will be dealing with those challenges. We will also be having, a peculiar South African challenge, and that is load shedding. I think we created that word. Jenny will also, deal with that under different sets of housekeeping announcements. The video that will follow our introductory remarks will tell you more or less where we're coming from, the ideas that we have behind this particular network, the fact that we want to be unashamedly African in the orientation of our discussions, and of course building an African network, in conversation with our friends that have been with us for so long. We have very modest aspirations. For those of you who know me intellectually and otherwise, I don't have grand scheme things in my head. We would simply want to just build a network of friends and collaborators that are interested in studying the university on our continent from a critical stance, okay? So something that's a bit different from the conventional higher education study, and then one that can contribute to a critical ontology of ourselves, that we understand clearer what it is that we're actually doing as a basis to shift our praxis. Our own university have a very, very strong African imperative. We were a bit twatted by COVID-19. But earlier this year in June, we traveled with our Vice Chancellor to Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. I met with a few of you there, so thank you very much for chatting to me. And of course, all those discussions then results in people coming together like this. The theme of the colloquium is very relevant, the way in which techno-rational thought is impacting on the university and whether we can hold critical reflexive solidarities together amidst those kinds of hegemonic development, And so part of that is that the colloquium, apart from its thematics, it's also just, it's an invitation to a friendship, for co-traveling the university in ways that makes its emancipatory potential come through more strongly. And an invitation to craft it together, We don't have dogmatic models and pathways in our head. This is an open space for that conversation to happen. So please enjoy the time that you spend at our university. I'm really looking forward to the program and, of course, looking very much forward to the informal chats with colleagues from various parts of our continent and the globe. Thank you so much.
So I really just want to echo and say welcome, colleagues. I think it's so affirming, especially after the last few very hard years, to see familiar faces in this room who were part of the Advancing Critical University Study process that we started in 2019. It's also an honor to see those who have been part of longer conversations about the university, who have enacted it in their practice within universities, in their leadership, and of course, invaluably, for those of us who are researchers, right, in the writing. There are, of course, others who we would have loved to have been here, who are no longer with us at all, and I think it's important to have a sense of their legacy and their commitments continuing in our own work. Then also to say, what an honor and a joy to see those newly joined here in this venue, beautiful venue, by the way, and also online, because we really are here to try to create and to connect communities of those who study higher education. Increasingly, it's not an easy endeavor to study the university. It's shifting, it's slipping, it's morphing, and of course, so are we as academic citizens. In some cases, the scholarship is neglected, in some places undermined, in others weaponized, threatened and threatening, and I think in many cases we are too. So just to echo, I think, what Andre has said, and I'm sure what many of us will be saying over the next few days, I think we should and we must persist in critical studies of the university. I hope, I guess I believe, that we can do so more robustly, more critically, more impactfully, when we are situated, yes, but when we are connected. So it's that ethos, particularly of reflexive solidarities, that is the ethos that informs this and why we've set aside this time over the next few days. So thank you to the formal contributors, from which we hope to learn, but also to all of us really, those who generously extend their knowledge and expertise, particularly intergenerationally, but also to those who really actively take the opportunity to build relationships over the next few days, to share learning and connections and opportunities. And I hope that we all find it a really enriching time. Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming. You'll notice that this is a network of scholars and students, which is what universities are about, scholars and students. And the concept university has existed on our continent much longer than many places. On the continent today, the model we are pursuing is a 19th century model that came in part with the colonization of this continent. But before then, Africans had universities. And those were mostly centers of scholars and students. Today, our history has almost obliterated that aspect of what the university means. And so we think that this kind of network is important to revisit our roots, inform the present, and chart a path for the future. The kind of network that will run across this continent, that will bring us together, generate knowledge on the kind of university, the African university, we would like to see. No one will solve our problems for us. It's only us who can think about our circumstances and infuse those ideas into what we do to find solutions to our problems. So I'm so happy that the conversation we began in 2019 is getting traction, and this network is growing. So I'm delighted to note that. And out of that, we're not going to stop. We'll rather continue against all odds to grow. And so right now, we already extend an invitation to you to come to Ghana in September 2023. That is to say, what we have started can only grow. And we'd like to see as many scholars and students from all parts of this continent networked, how strong that would be and how that would change the face of higher education in Africa. Thank you very much.
The ACUSAfrica Network's origins are tied to the 2019 Emancipatory Imaginations Advancing Critical University Studies Winter School. This event, conceptualized by Andre Kiet of Nelson Mandela University and Dina Beluigi of Queen's University Belfast, saw scholars from across the globe gathering for provocations, contestations, and disputations on the question of plural emancipatory imaginings for the university. One of the key pathway suggestions that emerged from the Winter School was the creation of platforms and opportunities for the co-creation of knowledge between students, academics, and communities. The first iteration of these imaginings is the ACUSAfrica Network, led by Andre, Dina, and Michael Okierofo, and their collaborative teams of Nelson Mandela University, Queen's University Belfast, and the University of Ghana. The network's online presence was established in 2020, describing its website as a dialectical space to foreground scholarship for advancing critical university studies across Africa in dialogue with scholarship from across the global south and north, with the substance thereof as shaped organically by its contributors, who are constituted from networks of scholars and practitioners across the world. The network further states that underpinning the work of the critical study of higher education is the endeavor to find other ways to study universities which are capable of thinking in plural forms of emancipatory higher education imaginations and futures. With the devastating onset of COVID-19, the network's first gathering was an online reflective discussion amongst members held on the 8th of July 2020. Titled The Implications of COVID-19 for CUS, the discussion was an important moment for the fledgling network and its members to regroup in the midst of a truly life-altering pandemic. 2020 also saw the first year of funding for Andre's Advancing Critical University Studies research project by South Africa's National Research Foundation. The funding, which is for the period 2020 to 2022, has been instrumental in supporting the network's online presence, the hosting of colloquia and various scholarly gatherings, and the overall development of the network and its various objectives. ACUSAfrica's first dedicated colloquium was held online in February 2021, with the title Critical University Studies and the Battle Against Global Racism. A number of speakers from the network, including Sharon Stein from the University of British Columbia and Christy van der Westhuizen from Nelson Mandela University, presented on their research and projects. Michael reflected on the position, role, and function of the network within a connecting web of ideas, and Aslam Fatah of Stellenbosch University spoke to the establishment of ACUSAfrica's South African chapter. The first keynote, Transforming African Universities and Epistemic Cultures in the Post-COVID-19 World, was delivered by Paul Zaleza of the United States International University, Africa. And the second, titled, If You Were a White Man, They Would Have Negotiated With You the Minute You Were Approached, Bodies of Value in Academic Life, by Shirley Ann Tate of the University of Alberta. The colloquium also introduced the ACUSAfrica webinar series. The first seminar in the series, titled Navigating Shomoy Escapes and Faculty Life in the Global South, was a panel discussion on the 17th of March 2021. A number of seminars have followed, including that of Su-Ming Khoo of the National University of Ireland, Galway, on sustainability, transdisciplinarity, and the public epistemic role of higher education, held on the 7th of October 2021. And by Michelinos Zimbalas of the Open University of Cyprus on refusal as effective and pedagogical practice, held on the 19th of April 2022. Also in 2021, ACUSAfrica's podcast series was launched. The first episode, a paper by Andre titled Racism's Knowledge and University Transformation, originally presented in the Society for Research into Higher Education Southwest Network's webinar series. Other episodes include a paper by Kopano Ratele of Stellenbosch University titled The World as It Could Be, Africa's Psychology for the Inferiorized, and a presentation by Rilebogile Moletsane of the University of KwaZulu-Natal titled Rethinking Mandela's Legacy in the Midst of War on Women's Bodies, a Feminist Dance, a co-stance. Two book projects linked to the network are currently in various stages of production. The first of which, Advancing Critical University Studies, edited by Andre, Dina, and Jason Arde of Durham University, flows directly from the 2019 Winter School. Although the edited collection does not focus exclusively on the African University or the University in Africa, most of the chapter authors are members of the network. A second project had its first workshop presentation and discussion session in August this year. The title of the workshop and the proposed title of the book is The De- or Recompositional Grounds of the University in Techno-Rational Times, and the project and book is coordinated by Aslam, Andre, and Shireen Mutala of the University of Johannesburg. During the workshop, Sarah Musuetsa of the Human Science Research Council, Sarah Nuttall of the University of the Witwatersrand, Pramesh Lalu of the University of the Western Cape, and Michael Peters of Beijing Normal University participated in an open seminar on the project title. The 2022 colloquium, Self-Reflexive Solidarities in the Techno-Rational Times, represents a key moment in the history of the network. As the first official in-person gathering under ACUSAfrica's banner, it brings its established collaborators, such as the institutions Nelson Mandela University, Queen's University Belfast, University of Ghana, and the National Research Foundation, and scholars from across Africa and the globe, together, along with new collaborators such as the Human Science Research Council. We hope that the network will grow in years to come and that we can work towards renewed solidarities across our continent and beyond to advance the critical study of higher education.
All right, so I thought I would just briefly discuss with you the first book project and our progress. This project came from the 2019 Winter School. The last 2 days of the Winter School were directly about workshopping, discussing, deciding, voting, deliberating, how to really create impact in terms of advancing critical university studies. And one of the main avenues in which the people who were there felt that we could progress this was in terms of writing a book. And the the central question of the book was really, how is critical university studies to be advanced? I mean, it's a massive meta question, but it's produced some incredible chapters, really. So at the time, when we got the abstracts, we thought we would probably structure the book along these ways, and you can see that the slide is taken from February 2021. We also found that from the abstracts, there were a range of themes and connections that were operating across the book. What I thought I would do now, because the book is almost at completion, is to share with you the chapter titles in the hopes that it whets your appetite as we discuss over the next 2 days, and to also read the book. I need to turn, though, to be able to see it. The African University's Innovative Self-Renewal, the intersection of critical university studies and decolonial theory, ethical implications for higher education internationalization. No human involved, no theory involved, the impossibilities of black studies in the UK and Canadian prairie academia. Interrupting colonial circularities in critical approaches to the study of higher education. Emancipation as rebellion or repair. Higher education, unsustainability, and possibilities for transformation and public good. Finding faith in the face of ugly truths, solidarities, and identities within and at the borderlands of the academy. Inside, outside imaginings of the university. Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee and Dog Eat Dog by Nick Mhlongo. The university as a site of workers' training and human development. Revitalizing the humanities, undisciplining sociology and cultural studies in South Africa. What else can be done? Shut down the center. The shifting of transformative responsibility within discourses of women's studies centers in Indian universities. Beyond student halls and libraries, postgraduate student well-being in the case of Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Disaffection at work, on silences, intersectional violence, and building the anti-racist university. And then emergences. So I hope that gives you a sense of the book that is to come. Thank you.
And we are almost there, especially for those who have handed in their chapters 2 years ago, Mikali knows. So we are almost there, okay? Almost. Thank you so much. Let me hand over, Michael, via you to Luan. Luan is just going to say something quickly on the NRF project.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luan Staphorst, and on a good day, I'm one of Prof. Keith's minions, and on a bad day, I'm a gremlin. But today I'm just quickly giving feedback on the National Research Foundation funded project that Prof. Keith has been given or working with the past few years. It started in 2020, 2021, and today, this year is the last year. So just in terms of the background of the project, much of in the line of what Prof. Keith has already spoken about, but the idea that on two fronts, both on a structural front, in terms of the higher education structures, the bodies that govern it in our country and elsewhere in the world, and a theoretical side. Both the theoretical and the structural level, we find transformation to be unconducive or untransformative. And the question is, how can critical university studies as a distinct field or a new paradigm within to think, how could that challenge that and become more transformative? So the project has 3 objectives. The first of which is to map CUS to understand what is this field in relation to the extant fields of learning, such as higher education studies and higher education transformation studies. The second is to analyze CUS in relation to extant programs, networks, etc. And then thirdly, to build networks, as we are doing here today. Just in relation to the progress on the project, our first objective has been met. We have finished a report, and that report is being turned into various articles and book chapters and publications, so it will be out in the public domain soon. In the second objective, the ACUSAfrica really is the embodiment of the second objective, and very importantly, the website has been fundamental in that regard in shaping the conversation and continuing to build and create new spaces. As we mentioned on the site, it is a dialogical space. It is there to get scholars from across the globe, especially from the global south and Africa, and to build those networks. And the third objective as well, specifically linking to the ACUS website. And just shortly, in terms of our research, when we mapped HES, or Higher Education Studies, Higher Education Transformation Studies, and Critical University Studies, just a short overview of what these three paradigms are and how they differ. And it's just important to note that this is obviously very short and succinct, and there's nuance to it, but just to give you a snapshot. And if we just look at Higher Education Studies and Higher HTETS and CUS in terms of methodological questions, we can see that HES asks normal kind of questions that we expect from a higher education journal. We'd ask questions, what are students, staff, and stakeholders perceiving in a particular higher education context or space? Higher Education Transformation Studies links those same kinds of questions much more to the question of transformation, while CUS asks the idea of the university. How is the idea of a university defining student experiences, staff relations, stakeholder relations, and perceptions? So we move from the particular to the more generative questions of ideas of the university, and that kind of approach, entangling or disentangling the idea of the university, engaging how that idea of the university gets into a physical form or gets pluralized in reality, those questions are engaged within CUS. But that said, CUS is not a singular in the sense of simplistic discourse or just a single type of voice or approach. As I mentioned, there is nuance. And we can look at this nuance or this kind of approach to CUS predominantly in two lenses. The one is the institutional CUS or CUS Anglo-America, and that's the critical university studies where it emerges traditionally in America and Britain, that asks questions about the university as historically good, historically just, historically something that is valuable, but that we have somehow lost our way. In essence, neoliberalism, the 1990s, globalization, all of that was terrible, but look how good the university was in the past. Look how perfect it was. We need to go back. But there is another tradition, which is predominantly represented by abolition university studies, that says no, the university was never as benevolent, never as good, never as just as the traditional CUS scholars would like you to have believe. Rather, this university has always been a site of struggle, has always been critically engaged with injustice, creating injustices, creating power differentials in ways that reproduce inequalities. And if we look at these two traditions, the ACUSAfrica network both follows the abolitionist university studies grouping in being critical, but we also very particularly position ourselves as drawing from extant critical scholarship, like decolonization, Africanization, African feminist studies. So it's not a reinvention of the wheel, but rather as a space in which we can bring the plural emancipatory in for critical engagement. And as we say in Afrikaans, fluit, fluit, my story is uit. Whistle, whistle, my story is done. Doesn't sound as beautiful, but there you have it.
Exciting, exciting. Good morning, everybody. No better way to start a hybrid colloquium with a truly hybrid session. Yes, so we are going to have our very first session of this this long-awaited colloquium. We've been looking forward to this day for the last several months, some of us, and for the organizers, the last couple of maybe years. So our very first session is going to be delivered, our first provocation. Our first provocateur is a seasoned member of this network, Professor Su-Ming Khoo. Professor Su-Ming Khoo is an associate senior lecturer and head of sociology in the School of Political Science and Sociology at the University of Galway, Ireland. Su-Ming is a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela's Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation, CRISHET. So she's online, and please, it's also very late in the night on her side, on their side, so we look forward to this session.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so I thought I would just engage with the topic and the title, with this title of my own, which is Conversations We Avoid Having. And it's really and this to and during the Second writings of the Frankfurt School, specifically Techno-Rationalities associated with the works of Herbert Marcuse, who wrote a book called The One-Dimensional Man, and the works of Adorno, Theodor Adorno, and Horkheimer, who wrote this important essay on the culture industries, and in essays that were titled Dialectic of Enlightenment. So this was already about the Enlightenment in the West having problems with the concept of itself. says in her book about surveillance capitalism. What is at stake in our new phase of capitalism, surveillance capitalism, is the inward experience from which we form the will to will and also the public spaces to act on that will. So just to move to solidarities, because the theme was reflexive solidarities, and to ask if solidarity is possible. Of course, there's a lot of problems with solidarity as idealized unity. So here I'm not talking about this non-performative, idealized unitary solidarity, but instead a non-ideal performative solidarity, which is reflective. So I draw on this from the feminist theorist Jodi Dean. Reflective solidarity is performative engagement in dialogue, doing something by saying something. And this politics of solidarity is powerful, yeah, because it is performative engagement, because it emerges from concrete practices of disputation, contestation, confrontation, and struggle. In this, identity is not an essence. Identity is a place from which we begin this disputation. And acting in common implies solidarity in a more difficult and annoying way. Solidarity requires a non-symmetrical logic of action, a non-symmetrical obligation and benefit. So it's not a both sidesism, because the sides are not symmetrical. So obligations and benefits, responsibilities are different because there are historically structured needs and harms that our conversation comes within. And this means we must always draw on this idea of indigenous and localized epistemologies of coordination. Coordination must be there to prevent further deepening of existing harms and exclusions. I've drawn a lot on this short essay by Kyle White on epistemologies of crisis and epistemologies of coordination. It's very, very helpful to think about why coordinate in order to prevent further deepening of harms and exclusions that could be experienced otherwise by the already vulnerable and disadvantaged. And commitment to this type of performative solidarity is very inconvenient and awkward. It involves friction with awkward and inconvenient others. I've just started reading this wonderful posthumous book by Lauren Berlant. I really can't believe that they are not with us to write even more excellent books on the inconvenience of other people. And it is a sort of a queer take on how we deal with political forms, and to challenge form, to queer it to argumentative and intimate forms, to make these forms available to the inconvenience of thinking that loosens questions, unlock thinking's repetitions, and release their energies. So that's the point of inconvenience. So just to start wrapping up then, how can these performative solidarities be situated? They can be situated as both goal and strategy for producing knowledge alongside the struggles that are there, particularly those of already vulnerable and marginalized communities. And Rutledge and Derrickson talk about engaged research and the practices that you can engage in as a researcher, being moved by what is happening, dispersing power, resourcing solidarity, such as the network has been doing, challenging assumptions and norms, and finding ways to sustain collaboration. Situated solidarities are not the same as the fetishization of essentialized social locations, knowers and subjects. Social locations, identities are places from which we begin, but we begin to go towards collaboration that practically recognizes what are the valued resources and capacities, and how can we develop responsible relational reflexivity. So yes, just to really wrap up then, what is the place of critical higher education studies in this techno-rationality, where we see freedom and information technology as masks for domination by monopoly capitalism, which elsewhere I've written are really masks for oligarchy and control by the already very wealthy to further accentuate their polarization and hoarding of economic growth, development, and wealth. So we ask ourselves, what's the role of public higher education institutions and ourselves, the academics and scholars, given these issues of subjectification, this kind of political impoverishment and datafication of ourselves and our work? How can we think about the work of scholarship, research, education through these lenses of situated solidarities. How can we approach who has right to what, who has duties towards what, and responsibilities towards whom? What is freedom and what is flourishing? What place do we have for understanding and reformulating academic freedom and the idea of institutional autonomy against this autonomy robbing form of techno-rationality, and yet fight against the limitations which have been baked into the structure by colonialism and capitalism, the patriarchal, racial, techno-capitalist institutional foundations. So to conclude, I want to point to eccentric hope as something that we might have in common. And here I draw on the educational theory of Gert Biester, who argues for an education that is not egocentric. So this is what we mean by eccentric. It is eccentric. It is not centered on the ego, but it is on subject formation that can help people to be at home in the world. The philosopher Achille Mbembe talks about hope as something that involves a shared existence in common. And here I'd like to draw on the words of the Irish poet Seamus Heaney on the occasion of reflecting on the new position of South Africa when Nelson Mandela had been released, and why South Africa should have hope, and why he had hope for South Africa, and he had hope for this new beginning that was occasioned by Mandela's release and the ending of apartheid. That hope is something that is there to be worked for, something that is there that is worth working for, and something that is there that can work. That is not the same as optimism that the something that is there is going to work out. Yeah, that's unfounded optimism. But hope must be that something is there that is worth working for, that could work. And saying this in a feminist and decolonial way, is really draws attention to the fact that the liberal conceptions of hope and liberal conceptions of democracy have always suspected identities and movements, social movements. And they've always felt that civic politics and democracy and civic political selves and moral reasoning should be separated from the social and cultural context. But the feminist and decolonial critics always point to how it's impossible to do this. We must refuse this negation of the social cultural context, to refuse and go beyond the contextual logics and binaries of the capitalist and the racial colonial modern, and maybe to look to the thing that is beyond the abyss in the Portuguese philosopher Boaventura Sousa Santos's view. Yeah, what is beyond the abyss is an epistemology and ontologies that are post-normal, that are transdisciplinary, that include something else. We call this the principle of the included middle in transdisciplinary theory. And it's this possibility that there can be other realities that are already there and present, that might have been repressed, and that are part of our democratic conversation, that are part of our shared existence in common, and that we can hope is worth working for, and that can work when we work together with critical and reflexive solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very fitting provocation. I'm sure everybody has been provoked differently. That's I like the diversity of provocations you've put forward, and yeah, we look forward to to engaging over those provocations. But one of the things that caught me was, you know, being part of the world that now has a lot of communication, but little community. That was touching, you know. And she talks about the lack of mindfulness and, you know, the performative solidarity, which takes a lot of work and commitment to it, could be inconvenient. So I'm sure those are just a little, those are the bits that might have provoked me, but I know many more provoke more of you. We are going to have a break now as we reflect on this. And after the break, we are going to have three disputers who are all going to be online. And it's only after that that we shall then have general conversations around the provocation and the disputations that we shall have shared. So please, let's have a 15-minute break. And is that it? All right, let's do it. Thank you. Professor Shireen, would like to give you the platform.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be with you today. And special thanks to Prof. Andre Keert, who has introduced me to the network. And together with Aslam Fattar, we've met several times over the last year to discuss aspects of the network and in particular look at what CUS South Africa can offer. So thank you, Andre, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I will be with you throughout this important event. So my response is to Su-Ming Khoo's paper and provocation, both her abstract and her longer paper. Her paper presentation today didn't cover all the aspects she had in the paper. So I'm going to be possibly referring to those, which were not the substance of all of what happened today. The areas I want to look at are the public good, decolonization, the politics of knowledge, pedagogy and social solidarity, all of which she covers. I just want to acknowledge that in preparing this disputation, I worked closely with colleagues in the Saatchi Chair, Teaching and Learning, and Tobisi Ndaba and Everard Weber, in order to present what I'm doing today. So I think as a starting point, the paper raises important points about the neoliberalization of higher education, its impact on the public good of higher education, and the implications of the questions for the possibility of social democracy. I think very importantly acknowledges that the critique of neoliberalism has been going on for a very long time, and alternatives to neoliberalism have not gained ground. Instead, as Su-Ming very eloquently describes in a paper, there is a sense of dread and of rising darkness associated with the neoliberalization of higher education. She makes an interesting point that the regeneration of public things requires decolonial demands for restitution and restoration to be taken seriously, if hope for the public good is not to flounder on the rocks of colonial imperial legacies that continue to trouble democratic societies as they currently exist. I think what's important is this is a similar point that emerged from the student protests in South Africa about the call for free decolonized education being associated with the receding public good of higher education. Later in the paper, she makes another point about the demands of decolonization and the public good. And she says that the public good is currently constituted maybe inconsumable with the demands for decolonization and the necessity of reckoning with colonial legacies of higher education. She makes the point that restitution and reparation are required to remedy structural inequities if post-colonial public goods are to become more inclusive and legitimate. I think what we want to raise here is that the currently constituted possibly begs the question of context, because public good is constituted differently in different contexts. And in South Africa, the studies of decolonization and the politics of knowledge, expressed in the Fees Must Fall movement and the literature, is very much aligned with how we view the public good in South Africa, and also very strongly constituted around the transformation imperative of the post-1994 era. Su-Ming speaks to decolonization, and I just want to expand on some of these issues from our own South African perspective. I think, as we all know, it emerged as a rallying call in 2015 and 2017 from the students' point of view. Transformation had failed campuses and the communities, and obviously something more radical was needed. I think the main argument, which we are all very familiar with now, is that standards and knowledge were informed by Western systems of thought, and in education, this involved the tackling and dismantling epistemic violence and hegemony of Eurocentrism, completely rethinking, reframing, reconstructing the curriculum in South Africa, Southern Africa, and Africa indeed, and making it the center of teaching, learning, and research. I'm quoting Helata there. I think one of the challenges that I've faced in working in this area for a while now is often there's a slippage in our concepts. We need to differentiate quite clearly between what we mean between decolonization and decoloniality. Decolonization is broadly understood as referring to historical processes of ending colonization and its aftermaths, as expressed in curricular knowledge. Decoloniality, on the other hand, represents a challenge to Western scientific rationality in favor of one that embraces alternatives and indeed multiple frames of knowledge, authority, and epistemology, points that Su-Ming points to in her paper. Mbebe argues that epistemic transformation in South Africa involves the recentering of knowledge production systems to subvert epistemic violence occasioned by Western canons and recalibrate towards a new pluriversal and inclusive knowledge system. However, even within that statement and intent, there are a number of questions being asked about what knowledge, whose knowledge, and the famous De Souza Santos quote is that the answers to the questions about knowledge are indeed often partial and weak. Kierd adds to this discussion by noting that we need to include in the discussion on the decolonization of knowledge notions of epistemic justice and injustice. What's really interesting in the South African case is the push for recentering, the decentering of the European curriculum and the recentering of an African curriculum has never really taken place in the way that we expect it to, because the politics of knowledge production in an interconnected world has changed radically over time. And in my own reflections, it seems as though while we often talk in terms of binary, center, and periphery, in fact, there is much more fluidity and influence of the north and the south. Su-Ming also rightly alerts us to structural conditions, arguing that as long as poverty and these are not interrogated in its multi-dimensions, the project of decolonization and of knowledge may simply reproduce asymmetries of power, knowledge in our universities and societies. Expanding on this in work that I've done with colleagues, we focus on 3 dimensions of the material, economic, and epistemological deprivations, and how all this impacts on the knowledge project in higher education. I think the other view I want to put forward is that while we often, while we know that the project of deep transformation is from colonial and apartheid past is variable and incomplete, change has taken place. And often I feel as though we need to have a more critical perspective about presenting this as 2 irreconcilable discourses, a point that Chris Brink eloquently notes, where he says, on the one side, there's the dominant paradigm of a hegemonic, neoliberal, Eurocentric, Western studied model of the university, and on the other, there's a discourse of an insurrectionist decolonial movement fighting for a viable alternative to a dominant paradigm, especially visible in Africa. He argues that this idea of irreconcilability is too simplistic. And I suppose the view that I'm moving towards is within this apparent hegemony of the Western standard, there are a range of voices calling for change on a broad front, including all of you who are present today. And in fact, what this change is very congruent with what decolonial voices are advocating. Moreover, there's an increasingly body of empirical evidence and research on decolonization practices, as evidenced in the recent book by Janssen and Walters. But I suppose in a moment of self-reflection, I want to say that in the heat of the struggle, we often reflect too little on the complexities of meanings, decolonialism, post-colonialism, and how these constructs actually play out in the daily churn of institutional life, point I will return to, and what this means really for the politics of change and radical change at its roots. I think we often slip back into old frameworks and resuscitate these issues of intellectual dependency, imperial durabilities, a narrow view of IKS, maybe an over-reliance in the Pan-African context on Latin American discourses. I think what I'm arguing for is that we need new conceptual and theoretical departures, theory building, and much more empirical rigor in pursuing the questions of decolonization and the institutional expressions of the knowledge problem. For example, we know little of the disciplinary complicities in the production of new knowledge in the wake of imperial entanglements. And this was very eloquently and evidently provided in South Africa's contradictory position during COVID-19, where in the changing knowledge order, we were both in South Africa, the leading inventors in medical science around Omicron, at the same time deeply dependent on vaccine distribution from rich countries. Clearly a much more cross-disciplinary view is necessary, as I think Su-Ming points to. I think Su-Ming also raises a very important point, and this is my last set of points, around building and creating solidarities within higher education on the African continent, and that goes beyond the current boundaries and constituting publics, as she notes, in exclusionary and discriminatory terms. This is important, I think, because it resonates and relates, as my colleague in BC has said, to the idea of Ubuntu, which is the core of African culture, us working together instead of working in silos for a common good to address a common problem. We need to address these solidarities. However, as Andre and many of us who've worked in both management and as researchers for a long time, there is a difficulty, even as we talk about change, to discuss it, to get it on the agenda of our meetings, and to give it the importance it deserves. Much better, quite often, is to suppress dissent and develop a feel-good consensus. Universities are fragile because of the range of constituencies and peoples that must work together for the common good. Still, that which we oppose, such as the problems of conducting difficult conversations, and I hope the next 3 days will be about that, must be explained and understood. Last points. I think the dialectic of social being and social consciousness is as dynamic and as fluid in our times. We put differently, which my colleague Everard Weber often makes to me, is that while we are writing about, there are many publications on decolonization, the politics of knowledge, techno-rationality, how are we actually connecting this with institutional change? And I think this is one of the main arguments and one of the challenges for CUS, is the main argument is not only to critique in publication, but to ensure that it is ingrained in our everyday institutional practices. So the competitive, which is so strongly perpetuated by ranking systems associated with neoliberal practices, such as new managerialism and the obsession with numbers, takes away, I think, from higher education's contribution to the public good. The point is often made also, as we are in this Pan-African setting with Global North colleagues, is that there are issues of intellectual imperialism, where collaborations between North and South institutions are often more beneficial to the North than to the South. And these are difficult questions we must address. I think the big challenge is that we all, in an academic and in a political sense, need to work together, even if we work at cross purposes. I think the Fees Must Fall movement was possibly provided the best example of this. It was not an elitist project by a few. It was a cohort of Black students revolting against the fact that they didn't feel at home in any of these institutional settings that we are in today. The supposedly objective numbers that are measured annually and as a determinant of race and output are also social, political, and historical, as they are raced, gendered, classed, and discriminated by national origin. Embedded in these targets are coercive and sexist practices of managerial power. It is un-African and must change. Developing agency means collectively building national and international communities of understanding, and that is what I hope CUSAfrica aims to achieve in these techno-rational times as we deliberate over the next few days. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you for highlighting the paradox that we sit within the higher education setting. I would like to now invite our second disputer, Dr. Daniela Raffaelli. Please take the platform.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present today. I wish I could be there in person. Thank you so much to Andre for putting together the colloquium, the opportunity for all of us to come together and explore these important topics. Thanks to Michaela and Jenny for all the incredibly hard work behind the scenes, the emails, the information, the coordination. I'm very grateful to be a part of it. Being a part of Critical University Studies group has been an incredibly informative experience, and I've really enjoyed, even this morning, the presentation by Su-Ming and of course Shireen's response to it now. I wanted to spend a little bit of time focusing on Su-Ming's discussion of solidarities. In her talk, she speaks of solidarity as doing something by saying something, contesting, confronting, struggling. She calls it something that's almost annoying and difficult, something uncomfortable and awkward. We engage with sides that are not symmetrical. We have to attend to the historically structured needs and harms of different groups. We have to give practical recognition to valued resources and capacities. These are ways of starting to think about solidarity that are very different to, I feel, to the way that the more common conceptualization of transformation, for example, has been undertaken in higher education. And I took Su-Ming's idea of the commonplace that she offered, something with which one argues, but about which one doesn't argue. This colloquium seemed to me a space to disrupt the way that transformation, commonplace in higher education discourse, is mobilized in our sector. As we know, transformation has in many instances been realized in demographic racial shifts that do not always correspondingly address the class-based inequality that is so deeply intertwined with race in South Africa. Transformation is itself produced by and locked into discursive fields that have framed its organizing concepts and principles in ways that serve its reproductive and preservationist impulses, through interventions that often do not threaten its structural frame. In other words, we often end up inadvertently re-racializing the system while attempting to deracialize it. Meaningful deracialization might then be an attempt towards solidarities that are rooted in an encounter with race, class, gender, and other dimensions of society that have been historically shaped in South Africa. The question that I asked myself is this possible in a techno-rational society, in a higher education institution that is firmly embedded in and constituted through the neoliberal principles that have generated the rationality of technologically driven knowledge? This idea of higher education as embedded in techno-rationality has been fueled by the rise of ideologically invoked notions of quality that morphed into a hegemonic excellence rhetoric that currently permeates our sector in ways that legitimize distributions of worth that are racialized and that occur along historically produced university hierarchies. The success of the modern institution is profoundly facilitated by the self-disciplining that accompanies the striving for excellence, which functions at the capillary level to regulate and enhance the performance of academics as workers. In a sense, excellence is then mobilized as ideology, as a moral and individual imperative that furthers the interests of capital. In this way, transformation principles are locked into a larger discourse and logic of excellence, which produces a general horizon of meanings about its own importance and centrality with powerful distributive capabilities. Interestingly, a key feature of excellence is the de-differentiation of the economic and cultural spheres, something that Su-Ming also touched on. In higher education, the cultural and social worth of knowledge has been eroded in favor of its economic value via the mobilization of excellence as a measurement of worth, an institutional vision and mission, and an organizing principle for the activities of the university. The ranking systems of higher education, discussed now by Shireen, are based on the excellent performances of universities and are designed to standardize and organize institutional worth. We can identify these as apparatuses for the relentless production of research, which is the currency of the knowledge economy. By bestowing legitimacy on the institutions that are highly research productive, then, this economy becomes a reproductive mechanism fueled by a discourse of excellence that permeates the branding and presentation of the world-class university. As we know, historically white universities were designed and capacitated for research production. A self-perpetuating system that increases rankings, aligns with so-called international standards of excellence, attracts staff and students with more resources, and reproduces its metrics of worth. Historically Black universities, on the other hand, and technicons, which were traditionally designed for research application rather than research production, were designed to limit research productivity. The structuring of these institutions along apartheid's spatial logic has created a landscape in which research productivity, the key to institutional worth, is structurally foreclosed to the large majority of institutions in the country. The redistribution of resources alongside metrics of excellence that are proxies for research productivity is therefore unlikely to take place without the systemic capacitation of lower band universities for research productivity. However, as Su-Ming noted, the relations of production and not just the distribution of resources, the relations of production in the university have become themselves techno-rational. While transformation has thus been traditionally interpreted as the redistribution of resources along more equitable lines, it's rather the relations of production in the university that we must look at and that must be transformed and made solidaristic in order for change to take place. The South African university seems caught in a paradox in which international legitimacy relies on the reproduction of techno-rational and neoliberal relations of production that are often measured through excellence, where true public relevance relies on transformation of these very relations of production, their interpretation of the worth of the academy, and the ensuing distribution of resources along new lines of institutional worth. As long as transformation is enacted on the terrain of excellence, it cannot but fail to penetrate the systemic inequities that have been built into the system from the start. The almost total absence of solidaristic practices, collaborations, and deep institutional pairings amongst different types of universities is a clear-cut indication of how damaging the excellence discourse has been for the higher education equity project of the country. Perhaps by rethinking transformation as solidarities, we can ask new questions of ourselves. If solidarity undertakes a critique of techno-rationality as the basis of higher education, it has the means to disrupt many of the neoliberal practices used by the university to organize its current practices. Su-Ming ends with a reflection on the hope that is available to us, describing it as an eccentric hope, allowing people to feel at home in the world. And I think Shireen also commented on this in her discussion of Fees Must Fall as an expression of many students saying that they do not feel at home in the higher education system that they locate themselves. We have to start thinking about solidarity as performative and, as Su-Ming noted, solidaristic assemblies of democracy and care in order to begin to rethink the university as an equitable place for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that take on excellence. It's interesting that excellence is usually one of the, the principles that universities put out there as their primary strive. But that's a very interesting take on excellence versus solidarities. If Amos is now online, are we able to know that? Okay. So this is the point we've all been waiting for us to dive right in there. So we'll invite questions, we'll invite supplements. Please limit it to a question at a time from yourself and for 2 minutes at most. And we'll take a bunch of questions. And also, please highlight who you would like to respond to that question. All right, we'll start from the front. I'm sure that would help. Or is there a roving mic? I think there's a roving mic.
Are you the rational
So thank you very much. I'll try to be as brief as possible. It's a question to Su-Ming. And I want to take her back to the reference to the Seamus Heaney cure at Troy that was given to Nelson Mandela as a gift in 1990. And one of the ways in which I've been reading that work is that Heaney is asking us to think about what model of education will help us reach the other shore where hope and history rhyme. And I wonder, in some sense, if you could talk a little bit about, the kinds of educational modalities that you envisage. So, in my own reckoning with that, is Heaney wants us to think about whether the university might develop a critical concept of reconciliation that exceeds the histories of partition. So it's not actually decolonization that is at stake for Heaney in that play, but partitions that have devastated large parts of the world in the post-colonial world. So I wondered if you could say something about partition and education and what one might do with it. And then just secondly, if you could, the immaterial labor is a tempting proposition to rethink, because Hart and Negri gave us a very, very particular reading of what immaterial labor looks like. But in fact, what it's turning out to be in the post-colonial world, South Africa being a case in point, it's turning out to be a highly racialized formation. And whether the shift to immaterial labor now requires us to have a different and a reorganized critique of capital that the universities would have to be fundamental in trying to orchestrate.
Thank you, thank you. And were both questions directed to, okay, Su-Ming. All right, one more, so that we take the three. Yes.
In fact, I was hoping that, oh, there is a hand there. So
Okay,
shall we
we'll
go that
take
way?
both. We'll take yours and then we'll take yours.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Of course, this was wonderful, Sue, Shireen, and Daniela. Can I just check, Shireen, with regard to how do we get to a culture where we more or less drive at the complexity of meanings as intuitive within the kind of work that we do? Like it's part of our culture, you know, that things within the space is complex. And sometimes we drive too easily at taglines. That's the first one. I wonder whether you have some practical ideas around that. And then the second one for Daniela, of course, is that if the excellence discourse is so overwhelmingly hegemonic, what would be the new kinds of praxis that one can imagine that can work against that?
Thank you, Prof. Kiet. Yes, we'll have Prof. Jude.
First of all, I would like to thank the presenters very, very much. Very insightful stuff they really gave us. Joseph, I would like to ask 3 questions, but I will do it quickly.
Okay.
The first, to the very first presenter, sorry, I did not memorize the name. Why are things the way they are in our universities? Why have things continued to be the way they are? Because in English, there is a saying that he who pays the piper calls the tune. The second question to all 3 of them, and even to us, at what node of the higher education system are we going to propel the ideals this network stands for, to make sure that they actually get into action? Finally, do we have a ranking of universities that is based in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. So we will go right to you, Prof. Su-Ming, to respond to the question. We shall take a second round of questions. So let's first have responses to these questions. We'll start with the ones for Prof. Su-Ming.
Thank you so much for the discussions and also for the questions. The first question, I didn't see the questioner. Was it Professor Lalu? Yeah, anyway, whoever the question was, about what model of education can help us reach the other shore. I really loved this returning to this short interview with Seamus Heaney and the curate Troy, because I think it brought from the beginning of the time that we think we are in a reminder of the hope and the question of what transformation was all about, which in this question is about reaching the other shore, where hope and history rhyme. And it is something to do with what the other shore is with respect to what all the land and what all of this shore are made of: racial, colonial, capitalism, in which decolonization is not sufficient to bring a new reality because it's decolonization of the same side of the shore. So that we don't know is the answer. We don't know. And in fact, most of our education and our higher education seems to be oriented towards willfully not knowing and disavowing that another shore might even exist or be in sight. And that vast uncharted seas lie between this shore and the other one. But certainly it's about troubling what's on this shore, which is the structure that you alluded to with your question about your observation about decolonization not overcoming the problem of partition and hierarchical binaries of all kinds. So whatever the education is, the model of education is, it must be educational rather than effective, excellent, ranking highly, or whatever. It has to be educational first and foremost. And we have spent far too little time thinking about what is educational in our higher education. And we haven't spent much time thinking about what is higher in our higher education, which I think is about fostering the possibility of thinking that another shore exists and that ways might exist for us to collectively navigate towards it and find a rhyme between hope and history. So that's the first question. I know it's not a very good answer, but it's better than no answer at all. The question around immaterial labor, it's very much in these two short aphoristic books that I referred to in my talk by Byung-Chul Han, Infocracy and Psychopolitics. And it's a diagnosis of what's wrong with our Techno-Rational Times, that indeed it's no longer the material labor, the energy and the bodies of people that need to be exploited by capitalism. It's the data of people in order to sell the people's desires back to themselves under informational capitalism. So Byung-Chul Han says that we've become cattle, that that's what we are. We're not human beings under techno-rational capitalism. We are cattle that emit data. And this data then is captured and farmed by the farmers of the cattle in order to sell us back things using our attention as individual consumers, as information producers and consumers without community. So that is the key role of immaterial labor in informational capitalism and infocracy. It also has the labor, immaterial labor is also the subject of psychopolitics to be acted on by politics so that politics can continue to reproduce techno-rational capitalism. So it's very dark, I'm afraid, and full of dread. Yes. Andre, on kinds of excellence. Yeah, this is a very good question. What other kinds of excellence could we think about? Certainly, I think kinds of excellence that are not yet defined. Kinds of excellence that are something rather than nothing. Because this relentless techno-rationality has this relentless nothingification of our world. So that turn services into non-services, people into non-people, subjects into non-subjects, and things into non-things. So I think that kinds of excellence will be based on the somethingness of what those things are. And we have to have a conversation about the kinds of things we value and we hope for, that are worth working on and worth working together on, that there's something that we hope for, I guess. It's not very good answer, but certainly forms of excellence that are kind of substantive and based on something that we've had uncomfortable and awkward arguments and discussions about. Finally, Jude, why are things the way they are? Is it just a case of he who pays the piper calls the tune? And are there rankings of African universities? Well, there must be an alternative to all of these propositions. The things being the way they are, simply accepting the commonplaces as things we argue with but not about. And regarding rankings, if you want to overcome hierarchies, rankings are the worst tool that you could use to get away from hierarchies by creating new hierarchies. It's just the same logic, but in a slightly different form. So those are my remarks. I'm afraid none of them are very definitive.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are lots of nods here that I can confidently say those are very helpful remarks. There's still questions for Shireen on culture. Would you like to take that?
Very much, Ponzo. Just a couple of comments. I'll try and answer sort of all the questions that related directly. I think the first issue is a challenge to all of us. It is a call to action, that there's a huge disconnect between the amount of critical scholarship that exists in our institutions, and most probably in the room you're in, and on the online platform, and institutional change. So I suppose it is asking the question to all of us, where is our political activism in our institutions? And I think that is a real challenge. There's a huge amount of writing and publication. The second point I want to make is, the point that is made around managerialism and the disconnects that exist. And as Andre asks, how can we do things differently? I think there is a responsibility on us who straddle both the management and the academic or research spheres to somehow bring these two areas together. Somehow the critical scholarship needs to inform what's going on in our institutions and make better linkages. And one disconnect, obviously, is the university and community nexus. How do we deal with that? What was really interesting in the recent UCT a crisis that occurred around governance and leadership, as we were constantly bombarded with stats on excellence and how well the institution was doing, without getting into the fundamentals of what was going on in the institution. And I think Liz Langer makes an important point here, that she says we often focus a lot on the academic curriculum, which I'll just conclude with. I think we spend a lot of time, I don't know how far we've got, but certainly the issue of decolonization, curriculum change is on the agenda, but we ignore what she refers to as the institutional curriculum. And somehow those two aspects need to come together. And finally, on what we can do, I think the COVID times has been really interesting. And on Friday, or the Friday before, we had an interesting seminar on pedagogy and wellness and the wellness of academics and students. And I think the COVID time has provided, in a totally unexpected way, opportunities of how we can look at pedagogy and pedagogical practices differently. Can students be co-creators in terms of the curriculum? Can we change these relationships of power, knowledge, and authority and disempowerment to move to empowerment? What about, very, very importantly, has come up in the last while, is the issue of pedagogy and care and empathy, and within that, health and well-being. And I think these are all the conversations that we need to be, can we be excellent at being caring and empathetic institutions, as well as, producing output and publications. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniela. Sorry, Shireen, thank you so much. We'll hear from Daniela, who had raised the point on excellence. I know it has been tackled by a few other speakers already. So, Daniela, are there new ways to look at excellence? Are there different ways to look at excellence in your disputation?
Thank you. I know that Andre, in my discussions with him, is always much more optimistic than I am about what the university could look like. I suppose, you know, the simple answer would be the revolution, disrupting, you know, the economic infrastructure of the system we're working within in order to change the terms of engagement. That's always my first kind of thought. But I also know that when South Africa was negotiating its transition to democracy, we came up against, in the white paper, we came up against the question of local relevance and global excellence. And how can we undertake the public good? How can we undertake becoming institutions for the public good that are socially, contextually relevant, challenging the status quo, rather than simply slotting into, you know, the machine? And the white paper says that we have a formidable challenge of integrating higher education into the competitive arena of international production and simultaneously reconstructing domestic social and economic relations that were shaped by apartheid. So we've never been blind to the conflicting or contradicting demands of our role in higher education. And I think what we're highlighting is that the quest for international legitimacy has completely overtaken perhaps the search for relevance and the public good, although these are also contested terms. And perhaps what we can strive towards is seeking a balance that is able to hold, you know, both of these competing demands, so that our institutions can be viable and also be working for the good of the society that we're in.
For that amazing response. I was just thinking about what Shireen also said earlier, if we can be excellent at empathy, excellent at caring, and I'm wondering, often when we put new measures of excellence, then they become new ways to compete. But I wonder if competing for a thing such as care and empathy would still hold the care and empathy in it. But it's a very interesting disputation there, and something to think about. There's one more question left, and I think that will actually go likely to somebody from the network, maybe Michael or Andre, on the question of at what point are we going to propel the ideals of the network? At what point would we know that we are there to propel this? A quick response to that. Yes, we're going to have a round of 2 questions, and then, or will you come back with that? Okay.
But we only need like 2 questions because
okay.
We have saved now a bit of time. It would be lovely if we can stay
afloat.
Okay?
Yes.
Because we have a long day.
Okay. All right, 2 questions. 1 question here, and ooh, and it's more questions.
Okay. It's on. Okay, so I've been hearing about academic politics, and the concept behind it is something that I can definitely discuss because I am a student at the Nelson Mandela University. I've been hearing great minds, and I just wanted to add on, you know, like the younger mind of what is going on in this topic. I'm originally from the DRC, and I have friends from Nigeria, Sudan, America, Sweden, and we all come here because we have this whole idea that, you know, like universities is where great minds meet, and we create, we build, and we try to better the communities, try to better the countries, you know, just trying to better the world. But then we come here, and then there is so much discrimination because of not only your color, but because of where you're now coming from. So in the academic political side, you have these great minds that can't participate in certain activities or be in certain groups of, speaking, collecting ideas, doing research, because now you are now classified in a certain box because there's a bigger political agenda behind university institutions. How can we break that chain?
Very good question. Very good question. Yes, we'll have the two, and that will be it.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. This goes to Su-Ming. I think one of the things Marcus had talked about was that technology is an ideology that creates a culture of needs. And I think Su-Ming had talked about the fact that she did talk about the distinction blurring between true and false needs and our human needs. So my question is, from a critical lens perspective and also from ACUSAfrica perspective, how do we create a new culture of need that will ignite the challenge for us to Africanize the knowledge production and structures, and also that relates to the reality of our higher institutions, and not just that, but also helping to solve our unique and peculiar problems?
Thank you. Wonderful question. And finally, short.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to ask something. The first disputer stressed the issue of decolonizing. Now, and when she was trying to respond, she was stressing higher education being the driver. So when we need decolonization of our attitude, mind, but then the first disputer is stressing that has to be done with higher education. And my question is, how successful can we be if we put emphasis on higher education and not the entire education system? Because higher education may not do wonders if you have problems at the preceding levels. So the moment you stress one level, and yet this is a problem which needs a lot of entrenching certain values right from the start of the education system. So my bother is still, how successful can higher education be in helping to decolonize our mind and our attitude so as to enhance solidarity in this techno-rational era? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Okay, so Su-Ming, I think you have the most questions. Please take it away.
Okay, so the first question I think it relates to Shireen's discussion, really, about institutional change and the hidden institutional curriculum, which is not changing even as we're changing the academic curriculum. So how can we break the chains? I think at that institutional level, by looking at, what are the hidden curriculum of the institution. But also it means, striving against some of those other commonplaces, about nation, about race, about borders, about nationality and citizenship, because a lot of the discrimination, the practical problems of discrimination concern costs, fees, immigration restrictions, residential restrictions. And these are practical issues that hugely affect people's lives and play out various forms of discrimination, national discrimination, racial discrimination, sexist discrimination, homophobic discrimination at the institutional level. So I think it's really about transforming our institutions to be genuinely undertaking their responsibilities to end discrimination, to bring about more equitable relationships, and not just to do it in a tokenistic way by, having some sort of diversity marketing initiative, but actually thinking about how the institution is complicit and also profits from various forms of discrimination, such as international fees, really expensive accommodation, lack of supports for students, especially international students. So are those contributions from the colleagues in critical internationalization studies and ethical internationalization studies are important as starting points, because that's where the other comes in within our borders and within our institutions. So that's my first response to the first questioner. The second one on technology being an ideology and creating true versus false needs, and how could we develop a new culture of needs that gets us beyond the fake needs and more towards real needs. And it's like changing any culture. First, we need new language, and then that language has to become common. So I think we need new language of needs. And I mean, I work in development studies too, and we've been working on this problem for several generations now. How do we redefine needs beyond just economic production and instrumental treatment of human beings? And, personally, I'm trying to learn more about the human development and capabilities perspective that would think more broadly about what is it that humans need to flourish, to live together, to become the kinds of beings and do the kinds of doings that they have different reasons to value. So the human development and capabilities approach is, for me at least, a productive and generative set of conversations and discussions on how do we get beyond true and the false needs of techno-rationality. And it's always back to the same non-instrumental reasoning that human beings are to be dignified and to be loved and to be respected. They're not to be used. And that is the kind of main moral compass of that humanistic approach. So yeah, that's a provisional answer to that. And the last question about decolonization of higher education, it comes back to the somethings rather than the nothings. That decolonization should not be only about form and formal disavowal of a political status. It has to be about content. And it's something that relates to what's inside institutions and also more broadly. And I think it relates to revaluing the somethings. So decolonizing the curriculum is important because the curriculum is always about something. Curricula are always about maths or botany or music or ethics or economics. And it's within these somethings that we have the potential to think about freedom and responsibility and what would be emancipatory and what is it that we are responsible for. So those are my three provisional answers to those questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Su-Ming. And then there was the last question on should we concentrate on the higher education space when problems also emerge in other education spaces? Daniela or Shireen, is any of you up for that? Or will it be part of the wrap-up from
education system? I'm not sure. I don't know enough about, in detail about the Pan-African context, but the way in which education as a whole is siloed, between education and training, primary, higher ed, and post-school education is certainly one of the biggest flaws or fault lines in our education system. And simply, for example, we don't have an effective post-school education system, which means large number of young people are not in education, training, or employment. So I think the person who spoke is absolutely correct in pointing to the fact that there are always these competing priorities which relate to fiscal issues and financial issues and resource issues. And certainly we do need to look at the system more holistically. I just wanted to make a point. I think the student who spoke on the issues of xenophobia, are really critically important. And as we see, it's both a South African and international phenomenon where the world is divided in terms of race, inequality, who belongs, the huge flows that are going on between the South and the North. And I do think that we need, as a country, in our institutions, political leaders, vice chancellors, need to have a much stronger stand on these issues of xenophobia and exclusion. Thanks very much.
Very much. In the break, somebody actually mentioned to me, there's some people who should be in this place, because it's also one thing to have these conversations and another to have these conversations with people who have the power to make the changes. So thank you very much for the responses. And I would like to invite you to... Daniela, would you like to have any final remarks? Max?
Thanks. I think, like, as a general comment, higher education is always one institution among many in a society, and we have to look at, I suppose, the larger values of whatever system we're working in, how higher education fits into that, how education as a whole fits into that, what we're educating for, who we're educating, who's doing the educating, what we're teaching, and think through all of these like enormous topics in the context of historical inequity, the ways that South Africa, our particular context, has been shaped, and where we're trying to get to. So, like Shireen said, higher education often maybe isn't perfectly aligned with other aspects of other social concerns, and maybe if we think through some of the bigger questions about where higher education fits in education and what its role is in our society, then we can come up with more fruitful ways of answering these questions. Of course, I don't have a clear answer, but those are my thoughts about what's been said in that regard.
Thank you, Daniela. And Prof. Kiet, please take the floor.
Joe, we've coming along now for a few years. The question around the network, and we also just have to double check that we are not dropping some of the questions in the chat, is a very straightforward one. The one is that we have to co-travel this journey. This is part of the network, family building projects. And, for us as conveners, we never had like these big, grandiose ideas in mind, but simply trying to build solidaristic relationships, across our different parts of our continent and see, what contributions we can make with regard to unburdening the emancipatory potential of higher education institutions. That's the broader sense of where we would like to go. But in the context of this discussion, a university is never just simply a university, monolithically speaking. I think that the key question that Shireen raised earlier around the complexities of meanings is precisely our responsibility to acknowledge different types of universities within a university. You have emancipatory impulses, you have preservationist impulses, you have reproductive impulses, you have all kinds of spaces within the university. Some people refer to that as holding spaces, others fires on the margins. But it is true that the university, at the same time that it resists its own transformation, there are people and pockets within university that, of course, rebel and work against those as well. One has to acknowledge all those different sets of complexities, within single institutions and within sectors. I am so sure that if you want to do a proper audit of knowledge with regard to the decolonial track in South Africa, you would probably get to a massive library in terms of what scholars have already been doing, over the past decade and so. So whilst we, have huge concern about, what universities can do, and its more reproductive impulses or non-transformative impulses, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there are many, many, transformative spaces within universities, not only in our country, but our continent and, of course, across the globe as well. Just as part of that challenge around the complexities of meanings that Shireen asked us to focus on earlier in this session. So thanks for this, Joe.
Thank you, Andre. Always interesting how you mix us up with these responses. But colleagues, I hope you'll appreciate with me the contributions of the network, the contributions of the speakers we've had, Su-Ming, Shireen, and Daniela. Please join me to just thank them, give them the warmth all the way from here at the North Campus. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe, and also just to add my thanks so much to the speakers today. It was an absolutely fantastic opening to this colloquium and the themes we want to explore over the next 3 days. Just from my side, so lunch will be now until 1:45. If by 1:45 everyone could be back in the venue to start, that would be fantastic. I don't know, Joe, what's for lunch. It's a surprise. Hopefully it's a good surprise. And then just a couple of other things. Load shedding for today is scheduled for 4 o'clock in the evening until 6:30. There is a generator which will switch on, but there's probably going to be about 2 to 5 minutes of lights out and about 15 minutes where the Wi-Fi will probably be down, but after that it'll come up. So for the second session today, we're going to aim to finish on time so we don't hit the load shedding with all the tech, because, I don't need that in my life right now. And then lastly, the gap between 4 and 6, between the day sessions and the evening session, there will be time for people to have bilateral meetings if they want, to do whatever. It's like free time. I will do a walking campus tour for about an hour. If anyone's interested, I think we can meet at the front of the venue at 4:20 after everyone sort of had tea or whatever, and we can go for a walk and come back by 5:20. There are some books outside if anyone wants to page through. I think that's all the housekeeping, Andre.
And the exhibition is not here.
There will be an exhibition in the foyer, but I think that might only be up tomorrow, so look forward to that for then. Yes, so thanks very much, enjoy lunch, and see you back here afterwards. Thanks.